So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is not only the last verse in today's scripture reading, it is also the last verse of the Gospel of Mark. In most Bibles, we actually find two other endings for this Gospel, but it is believed that they were added in later centuries and that the author of the Gospel meant those words to be the last. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went to the garden that first Easter morning carrying spices. They were going to prepare Jesus' body, as was the Jewish custom of their day. And as they walked in that early morning, their biggest worry was how they were going to roll away that great stone from the entrance to the tomb. They knew they couldn't do it by themselves. But when the women got there, the stone was already rolled away. Somebody had obviously got there before them. So you can imagine how much courage it took for them just to enter the tomb. They didn't know who or what would be there. And what did they find? What did they find when they entered the tomb? There was a young man dressed in white, sitting to the right side of the tomb. And the women, according to the scripture, were alarmed at his presence. Well, you can imagine that they would be. The fear obviously showed on their faces, because the first thing that he said to them was, "Do not be alarmed. Do not be afraid." You know, it's a phrase that we hear a lot in the Bible. It's usually followed by good news. Think about the Christmas story. The angel that spoke to the shepherds, the angel said, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people." Similarly, this young man in the tomb says to the three women, "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look to the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." You can imagine the thoughts that would be going through those women's minds. Who was this man? Where is Jesus' body? Who took it? Why has it been removed from the tomb? What did he mean when he said, "Jesus has been raised"? How could Jesus possibly meet them in Galilee? He was crucified. He died. We saw them lay his body in this tomb. So they went out and fled from the tomb. For terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid. The women didn't ask any questions. They didn't say, well, explain yourself. Like, why, what, where, when? They just ran away in terror. Now, biblical scholars tell us that the Greek that is translated into terror and amazement in this particular translation could just as easily have been translated into trauma and ecstasy. Trauma and ecstasy. The author of the Gospel of Mark was not mincing his words. He wanted us to know that those women were filled with emotions, conflicting emotions. Their experience was traumatic, so traumatic that they were afraid to speak. Their experience was filled with ecstasy, and how do you put that into words? Have you ever had an experience like that? One that was too scary, too wonderful, too weird to talk about? Why didn't you talk about it? What were you afraid of? Were you afraid that people might laugh? Might call you crazy or stupid? Were you afraid that if you talked about it, that would make it too real or maybe unreal? Why did Mark end his gospel this way? Why did he end it with fear and silence? We know that the story eventually was told. I mean, if it hadn't been shared, how could it have been written down? So obviously, it was shared. We also know that the Easter stories in the Gospels are all a little bit different. They have a different number of women going to the tomb, and often the women have different names than the ones in the version in Mark. So the story of that first Easter morning obviously got told, and it got told over and over again in different times and in different places until the story shifted in some ways. So the story got told. Why did the gospel end in silence and fear? Well, we also know that this specific version of this particular story was originally written for a particular group of people who were early Christians, and we know that it was written near the end of the first century. The story was written during a time of trauma. It was shortly after the Roman armies had squashed a Jewish rebellion where the temple in Jerusalem and much of the city had been destroyed. Jews were killed by the thousands, and those who were following Jesus' way were increasingly persecuted. It was written at a time when the followers of Jesus had many reasons to keep quiet. So this ending in the Gospel of Mark may have been written as an invitation for that community to speak out, to share their faith with others despite their terror and amazement. On Good Friday morning, I spoke with someone who was visiting our church, and he told me that he leads a small group in his own faith community. His passion is teaching others about the Bible and about their faith so that they're more comfortable speaking in situations where their beliefs are being questioned or even ridiculed. The evening before, during our Maundy Thursday service, we asked the participants to answer 3 questions. First, they were to list the stories that they knew about God's impact on the lives of people from the Hebrew Scriptures. And then they were to list all the stories that they could remember about Jesus, about his life and his ministry. And finally, they were asked to list all the ways that God has given them gifts, all the things in their life that they were thankful for. Participants did very well, but there was some trepidation at the beginning. Would you be comfortable talking to your neighbor about your faith? Could you articulate the good news of God's love, of Jesus' ministry, and of the Spirit's work in your life? Could you share your own moments of terror and amazement? Or would you be silenced by fear? I remember an experience that I had in the church that I attended in Toronto. I was part of a healing meditation group that was led by our minister, and one evening I had one of those moments. We were in the midst of the meditation, and I could feel the Spirit of the risen Christ moving through my body. I knew exactly where the healing was occurring because we were lying on a floor in an unheated room, and most of my body was chilled. But there was a spot on my lower back that was burning hot. When the meditation was over, I knew that a major shift had happened both in my mind, in my body, and also in my soul. Later that evening, I shared my story with a friend, and the sharing of the story was nearly as healing as that moment itself. I have had many people share their spirit stories, their angel stories with me, their stories of terror and amazement. I have to tell you, it's a wonderful, life-giving thing to share those kinds of stories, and it's just as life-giving to be privileged to hear them. This abrupt and silent ending in the Gospel of Mark is an invitation for all of us to share the good news of God's love. It's an invitation for all of us to move past our fear and to describe what the risen Christ means for us. It's an invitation to share heartfelt stories of how the Spirit has moved in our lives. I challenge you to take up that invitation.